Okay, welcome, welcome visitors. It's glad to have you. We're glad to have you here. You got unlucky enough to get me as a presenter for your first and only journal club, but that's okay. My name is Matt Compton. I'm an occupational medicine resident here at the University of Utah Rocky Mountain Center for Occupational and Environmental Medicine. I'm a second-year resident, and the article I'm presenting today is entitled "Driving Performance and Cannabis Users' Perception of Safety: Randomized Control Trial." So almost exactly 1 year ago, I presented an article about pilots and heart rate variability. And I chose that article because I had an interest in both those subjects. So I'm a flight surgeon in the Air Force and have a sports medicine background. So those two things were interesting to me. And I felt like that I had some knowledge in those two things and could speak intelligently about those. This subject, on the other hand, I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about, and that's both from an academic standpoint and a personal use standpoint. And I don't delve into that too much, so it's a little bit different from me presenting on this subject, but it is an interesting topic to me, not only because it's a hot topic and a very concerning topic from a public safety standpoint, but also because I've kind of noticed a trend in the past maybe 5 or 10 years of sort of other influences being involved more with medical research. And so I wanted to get a little bit smarter on the data and what's out there as far as this subject so that I could know when decisions are being made on a policy level, like if those are sound decisions and if they make sense. Side story. So this week, they asked me to present at an Air Force conference in Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio, about occupational injuries from a sports medicine standpoint, and that was fun. But the Air Force pays for your trip, but a lot of times they're kind of stingy with rental cars, right? So they're like, "Oh, I can't have a rental car." So I was like, I don't want to be in Ohio because you have to drive a long ways without a rental car. So I just decided to foot the bill and pay for my own rental car. Well, nowadays there's 2 options for rental cars now. It used to be you just went to Hertz and got your thing, but now there's another option. So it's number one, you can go to Hertz or Avis or Budget and get your rental car, or you can use one of these peer-to-peer rental car services. Like it's like an Airbnb for your car, right? So being a little bit of a penny pincher, I'm like, maybe I'll go with that because the peer-to-peer ones are sometimes cheaper because the big companies have to pay for employees and business expenses. So and there's these companies that do it for cheaper. And so I went through Turo, the rental car app. Has anyone ever used that one? Yeah, it's actually pretty streamlined. Like it was super easy. You just do the swippy swipe thing on your phone and you get a car and you don't have to talk to anyone or so it was nice, except for the fact that when I got to Dayton, got off the airplane, went to my car and opened up the door, and it was like this pungent, strong smell of marijuana that came from the car. I was like, oh. So I had to drive around Dayton, smelling marijuana, and probably like people that got in my car, or the gate guard at the Air Force Base is like, what is that in there, but I got thinking about it when I was smelling the marijuana driving around. I'm like, well, wait a second. If there's a strong smell of marijuana in the car, that means there's a good chance that someone was driving while either using marijuana. And I was like, that's kind of interesting. And this is after I had made this presentation. It just kind of made me think about that from a public safety standpoint. But okay. With that as a backdrop, let's talk about this article. So the purpose, it was to determine the magnitude and time course of driving impairment produced by smoked cannabis of different delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol THC content, the effects of its use history, and the concordance between perceived impairment and observed performance. So in other words, they were trying to figure out if, and further investigate from the data that's already been out there, how long marijuana impairs driving and if the drivers actually realize they're impaired. Some background. So it's the most frequently detected illicit drug among drivers involved in crashes. It has been shown in prior studies to reduce driving performance. We know that. But there's a lot of questions that are still out there as far as how much it impairs you, how long it impairs you, and what are the effects in a realistic population. So a lot of the studies out there are very structured, as they should be, and they measure concentrations in the blood of THC, and then they measure driving performance and try to compare those. But we know that we have some understanding that the THC concentrations in the blood are not always reflective of impairment. And so this study kind of used a more pragmatic approach to, okay, let's let people use THC until they feel high and then see what their driving performance is. And then the prior studies are of limited quality and generalizability. So the big questions are, when is it safe to drive after marijuana use or THC use from a medical standpoint or otherwise? And so, you know, it's postulated that 3 to 5 hours is a good range, but nobody knows for sure. And the reason we don't know for sure is because we haven't had time to establish a lot of the norms that we had for drugs, say like alcohol, right? So you see that blood alcohol table on the right there. We sort of have a good programmatic or regimented way of assessing blood alcohol content and where you're impaired. It's not perfect because everyone has a little bit different metabolism, but we don't have that for marijuana or THC because, number one, we haven't had the time to develop that. And it is more variable, we're understanding now, in what they call the smoking topography, like how long people smoke, how much they inhale, what their metabolism is. There's a lot of variables that go into the psychoactive component of THC and what that means as far as how long it stays in your blood and how much you feel impaired and what it causes as far as your driving impairment. We don't really have a standardized biomarker, basically, is the gist of that. This is a study that was looked at a meta-analysis of driving under the influence of cannabis and risk of vehicle car crashes. And you can see that in almost every study, the odds ratios were elevated for people who were impaired with marijuana for the number of car crashes that happened. This is another study from Colorado. It shows a correlation between when marijuana started to become more commercially available, and that includes some legalization and other factors, and then the slope of the curve of people who are being stopped and who had high levels of THC in their blood. It's hard to draw general conclusions from this because there could be a lot of confounders and other reasons for that, but it is an interesting sort of correlation that happened at the same time. So what are the unknowns? Well, we don't know for sure how THC affects drivers. And then what are the effects of the different product THC amounts and concentrations, whether it's smoked or consumable or ingested or whatever it might be. We don't know how the route of use, the metabolism, the tolerance play into intoxication or impairment. And then most studies are limited size and generalizability, and they have a lot of blinding problems, including this study, in fact. How does THC affect the brain? We think that it works in a couple different regions, and one of them is at what they call the CB1 receptors in the brain. And the CB receptors are on what they call astroglial cells, and astroglial cells in the brain, they have a strong role in regulating the intraneural signals. So what they found is that these receptors are found on the hippocampus cells, on astroglial cells in the hippocampus, and so they alter and slow down the glutamate receptor pathway. And what that basically means is that area of the brain is responsible for a lot of coordination and a lot of short-term memory interaction. So they think there's some impairment there, at least some potential for impairment in that realm of neural thinking. In addition, this is a study from Massachusetts General, and they use this thing called functional near infrared spectroscopy. And so that uses light to measure blood flow in the brain. And what they found was a reduced amount of stability of the interactions in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so what that does, it's suggestive of the disruptive influence of THC on the neural dynamics of the prefrontal cortex. And it could sort of tell us why there's these cognitive impairments that are associated with marijuana use. And so what does that mean in the prefrontal cortex? Well, it leads to deficits in attention, psychomotor function, impulse control, and decision-making. And also from the hippocampus, reduced ability to learn, recall, and short-term memory. Okay, so you got some background. Back to our study. This was the double-blinded, placebo-controlled, parallel, randomized controlled trial. They ended up with about 191 users between the ages of 21 and 55. They used a block stratification use, and the interventions included placebo, 5.9% or 13.4% THC, and then they smoked at ad libitum, meaning they said they instructed the users to smoke to a level that they would get a usual high at home. The primary endpoint was these composite driving scores, which I'll talk more about. And then they additionally looked at how they perceived their driving impairment, and they also collected history items as far as cannabis use in the past several months. So here's their flow chart. One thing I'll point out here is that there were a few patients who were excluded at the beginning of the trial because they were high when they came in, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Imagine that.
Yeah. So pretty comparable baseline statistics besides the male versus female, and they did account for that later in their analysis. Won't belabor that too much. So the inclusion criteria were age, using cannabis at least 4 times a month, holding a valid driver's license, driving over 1,000 miles per year, and willing to abstain from 48 hours before training and testing. They left out people who had history of TBI or other major organ system or psychiatric disease, pregnancy, of course, or other substance use disorder, and then THC above 5 nanograms per milliliter on the testing day. The driving simulation included a 1-hour sober training module, and then the actual experiment were a few 25-minute sessions in this particular simulator, which assessed pretty common driving scenarios like city and country driving. And then the 2 key reference tasks that they used to calculate the CDS, or the composite driving score, were maintaining lane position or not veering out of your lane, and then adjusting to a chase car in front of you to see if you could maintain a consistent difference or a consistent distance between the two. And then they calculated that CDS using those tasks, and they compared with a baseline driving score, and then higher scores indicated worse performance in this particular study. They did the simulations after a 30-minute, so they had the subjects smoke the marijuana. They did a 30-minute driving test, a 1.5 hour, a 3.5 hour, and a 4.5 hour driving simulation. Here's a picture of the sim that they used from inside. Looks like a pretty realistic sim, as much as you can have a realistic driving simulator. Getting better at these, I think. So placebo was at 0.02%, then they had 5.9% and 13.4% THC concentration, and they were rolled into these 700 milligram cigarettes. They were placed in a negative pressure room, told to smoke the way they do at home to get high, with a minimum of 4 puffs in 10 minutes. And then they did the simulations and venous blood collections after the smoking. The questions they ask about the perception of impairment, they said, how high are you, 0 to 100? And how impaired are you from 0 to 100? And then afterwards, they asked, how much did the drug affect your driving, and how well did you drive? The statistical analysis included generalized least squares regression for numerics, and then they used Poisson and logistic regressions for the binary and discrete outcomes. And then at first they had a 3-level outcome, and then they figured out that the 5.9 and the 13.4%, there were very few difference in those, so they combined them into one level where variable. And then p-values were significant at 0.05. Results, they had 191 people after they kind of pared it down and weeded out the exclusions. 118 were men. Mean age was about 30, and the cannabis use was over half days of the month, roughly, with 98% using less than 4 times per week. And then, as we talked about before, no significant background variable differences. Okay, so at 15 minutes, the THC blood concentrations were as follows, and this was kind of interesting. The placebo was low, which is expected, but the 5.9% THC was actually higher than the 13.4% THC at significant levels. So some words on blinding. Almost all of the THC group correctly guessed that they were in the THC group. It probably wasn't too hard to postulate that, but that is something to consider when you look at the study. Like they neither want THC, so that affects probably the way they approach their driving simulation or whatever it might be. No significant difference between the two groups. So almost all of the higher level of THC users and the lower level of THC users, they both knew they were in the treatment group, and there was no difference between that knowledge. And then also interestingly, about half of the placebo group thought that they had received the THC. So that was interesting, something. Okay, so there were no significant differences in crashes between the groups. That's kind of expected. I probably need more volume, more time, and more subjects to actually see those statistics kind of play out into more crashes, but they didn't notice any on this study. The THC groups had a significant decline in their composite driving scores at the 30-minute and the 1.5 hour mark. And you can see that on the graph. The ones on the left indicate a difference with a p-value less than 0.05, and the ones on the two on the right are close to that baseline. So indicating, no statistically significant difference in the 3.5 hour and the 4.5 hour testing. Again, no differences at 3.5 and 4.5 hours. And then I'm not sure where they got this 15% cut point. It might be something that's established in the literature, but at the 15% cut point, 45.5% would be considered impaired at 30 minutes. So that's a significant portion of the smokers at the 30-minute mark. So for the THC users, and regarding their perception of how high they were and whether they would feel comfortable driving, 47.5% would drive even though they were considered impaired at using that 15% cut point. And 68.6% said they would drive at the 1.5 hour. And then in the 3.5 and 4.5 hours, over 90% of the folks said they would. This scatter plot shows just there's no relationship between the THC blood concentration and the driving performance, which I thought was interesting as well. And let's see. No difference between the driving performance or the THC blood concentration on the THC content between the 5.9 and the 13.4%. So this was between the subgroups high, medium, or low intensity use. No significant differences in THC blood concentration. So they took people, say, okay, how much do you use? And they were divided into these three groups. None of them had any significant differences between what their scores were on the driving. Okay. This is the intensity of use plot as well. And the results kind of suggest that there are more factors involved than just the blood level when it comes to driver impairment, and they call it smoking topography. And it takes into account the puff count, how many puffs they take, what volume they smoke, the duration and the rate, as well as the interval of smoking. So what that sort of implicates is that the content of the marijuana in the cigarette or whatever the substance is, and also the concentration in your blood after smoking, they're unreliable measures of how impaired you actually are, according to this study. And that has some implications as far as, what are we using as far as legal limits for drivers, and the levels we have, and does the data we have support using those limits for legal purposes. As we talked about, there was a discordance between the perceived impairment and their actual CDS, or composite driving score. And it has obviously some public safety implications, and it highlights the need for us to establish a kind of a standard where we say, okay, this is impaired and this is not impaired, so that we can be on the same page as far as letting people drive. Okay. In conclusion, this is a randomized, controlled, placebo-controlled trial of regular cannabis users exposed to different levels of THC ad libitum. They had statistically significant worse driving performance scores. The content and prior use history was not associated with driving outcomes. And then patients seemed to self-titrate to the point that they yielded similar reductions in the driving performance despite what level of THC they were ingested or smoking. It indicates a lack of insight regarding the driving performance and a lack of relationship between the blood concentration and their impairment level, raising questions about the legal limits. So it was a pretty simple study, and I thought it was pretty good. It does have some drawbacks and flaws. I think the strengths were that it emphasized these realistic scenarios where a patient would smoke, where they would typically get high, and that's probably what people are going to use when they self-assess to drive. You know, this just perception of how impaired they actually are. And so it may be more accurate in some ways than collecting blood and making sure we're testing, you know, these regimented concentrations of blood on their impairment. But it's more difficult to study and makes it more muddy when you actually try to draw conclusions from it. They did have some randomization that was specified. The baseline populations were similar. They did mention intention to treat on their analysis. They didn't have any other interventions involved, and then their dropout and compliance rates were acceptable. The limitations were kind of more interesting to me. So the control dosing wasn't used, and that has pluses and minuses, like I talked about. The population, the study population, were a group of people who are often smokers. So that may introduce some selection bias when it comes to drawing conclusions on what the driving scores were. So, and also not generalizable to people who are naive or in other populations who are more vulnerable to THC itself. Driving simulators are not perfect either. Like, we know that it may not be completely realistic. And also, you know, people who are in the study this is kind of part of the unblinding part of that. But if you're in a study, you know, and you're in the THC and you're in a driving stimulator, that presents another variable for you. You know, you drive differently when you're being assessed than when you're on the road, just, you know, going from home to work or whatever it is. So it introduces a little bit of bias there, I think. The timing was not comprehensive. We don't know in between the half hour, 1.5 hour, and the 3.5 and 4.5 hours. Maybe there were some changes in there, or even after that point. They didn't talk about allocation concealment, and then the blinding issue, just both from a study participant and an assessor standpoint. It was hard to do, but it definitely is something you have to consider when you look at a study like this. So, okay. Here's some questions I thought of. We can talk about whatever you want, and we can hash through some questions, but do you agree with my assessment of the strengths and limitations? What would you add? What might improve this study design? And are these results applicable in other settings other than driving? So you can see a direct correlation between, although these weren't commercial drivers, you can definitely see a correlation between this and commercial driving. But are there other scenarios that are safety sensitive jobs that you might consider doing further study in this particular way? And then the concentrations of THC in cigarettes continue to rise, becoming more pure, more concentrated. And so how do we address that, and how do we stay ahead of this as far as regulation and from a public safety standpoint? And then oral THC is a whole different topic. That's something we can maybe, you know, discuss more if you want, but it may have longer duration. And what does that mean as far as impairment and blood levels? Same types of question in a different form of consumption there. So, okay. Ken, first question.
I have a question. If you go back to figure 2A, which is one of the early ones, right there. Oh, I'm sorry.
Figure 2A, where was that? Oh, there. This one?
Top, go back or full. One more maybe. There.
Okay, yeah.
Now this shows that people with the placebo, stoned at a lower level, drove better. Is that true?
That's how I'm interpreting that as well. So the placebo were below the 0 point.
So they're driving improved, correct?
Right.
From this.
From the baseline, from their baseline. Right.
Would you conclude about that or opine?
Yeah, so it could be that same bias that we talked about with the simulators, so they know they're in the simulator, they're getting assessed, and also some of the placebo drivers thought that they had been in the THC group, so that could have influenced their sort of perception of the whole scenario and made them drive in a different way or a safer way than when they did their baseline. Or yeah. Good question.
Okay, thank you.
Confidence intervals though.
So yeah, the confidentials, they cross 0 in this case, so it wouldn't be statistically significant, but it is something interesting to point out. Yes.
I noticed on table 1, the average age for placebo users was 28 and the dope smokers was 30. Is there any correlation by how long it stays in the system based on age? Like, for instance, when you teach defensive driving, which I do, we tell seniors that the effects of alcohol and impairment stay longer in seniors than do in young people because their metabolism is slower and doesn't process as quickly. So is there a correlation the same way as, I mean, if we're older, like, does it stay in your system longer and therefore you're impaired longer? Because your study was all like, to me, younger people.
I don't know if I put you in the old category, but if I do, then I'd have to be in the same category. So yeah, great question. I think we know that as we age, our metabolism goes down, and that's because, you know, our organs that process these toxins go downhill. They get fibrosis. We abuse them over time with whatever substances. So the ability for the liver and the kidneys to process these things, and just age in general decreases our ability to do that. I don't know if I know anything specific about, you know, is there a standard or is there something that we should be investigating further on age? But Dr. Chen.
Cannabis use disorder or cannabis metabolism or any other drug in older population has not been studied.
Hasn't been studied.
We don't know, but we do know that cannabis metabolism is greatly affected with how much fat adipose you normally have, and it can be stored, right? So the process of metabolism of knowing if you're intoxicated and stuff, like the science of cannabis is still very new. We didn't know about the endocannabinoid system until the 1990s. So it's really in its infancy compared to a lot of the other substances.
Thank you, Dr. Chen.
I feel like another weakness of this study is kind of, I mean, I don't know, I don't smoke weed, but I feel like if I did, and people were like, hey, you want to come, we got all the dubs you want. I'm gonna probably light up a bit more than I normally would. But I don't know if they would have accounted for that. Like, I feel like people would have gotten more high than normal because they have the chance to.
So in the study specifically, because it was available, that they,
Yeah, the people would have smoked more. And I feel like that was than the founders.
yeah, that's a good point.
I have 2 things actually. I want to say you kind of touched on the first one a little bit. Stuff that with people, it's going to affect how they perform, how they drive. The thing that I was thinking about is, doesn't smoking pot make you paranoid? Isn't that a side effect? Is that a common side effect?
That's a dose-dependent side effect. So at very low doses, it can quite make you relaxed, right? And that's why people use it for sleep. And then at higher doses, and higher doses is all relative, right? Like high dose for you could be different for me, right? And so it can be overstimulating, and then you have paranoia and psychosis and hallucinations and all the fun stuff. And the cannabis nowadays compared to cannabis in the 80s and 90s and 70s is that it's much more psychoactive with a higher THC content. So there's
Yeah, so that's a good point. And the same concept applies because we use it for an antiemetic, anti-nausea medicine. But if you use a lot of marijuana, it can cause this thing called hyperemesis syndrome. So it's dose dependent. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy where it's, you know, helps people in a low dose with anxiety, whatever, but then in a high dose, it does the opposite.
And some people take it to treat their anxiety and their depression. But I can tell you, it doesn't improve.
Yeah, the most recent study I read on that it showed that it didn't help with anxiety.
And in fact, it makes it worse.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
I think an opportunity for improvement in the study as well is the study specifically focused on individuals who regularly participate and recognize what, or, you know, at least they think they recognize what impairment feels like for them. Be curious to understand how individuals who don't regularly participate, the infrequent user, what their compulsive driving score would look like compared to the regular user.
Yeah, that's a great point and great question. And so that it wasn't generalizable to that population. On the other hand, like who are we going to be most worried about from a public health and safety standpoint? It's probably mostly people who are regular users. But
So if you infer from alcohol, because that's been studied a lot, we know that people who drink regularly and heavy are actually better drivers
That's what I was
than
going.
people who binge drink, right? So you have the Friday, Saturday night binge drinkers, go to the bar, slam 5, 6 drinks, and then drive. They're much worse and then are more likely to get the DUIs than the people who have a consistent alcohol use that are drinking a pint every night, right? Because you have a level of tolerance. So when you have someone who doesn't have the tolerance, their behavior, they haven't adapted yet and have that kind of
on the other hand, those who haven't developed the tolerance may have a higher threshold, personal threshold to drive as well. So there's lots of factors that are involved. Dr. Hegmann?
Adding a couple of things, there are multiple randomized studies showing similar results. So this is consistent with other evidence. And we have ASSP here. Let me note a couple of things. There are studies showing that 55% increased accidents among users, 85% more injuries, 78% more work absences. In Ontario, there's more fatalities from motor vehicle crashes from alcohol. They actually flipped. Go ahead.
increase suicidality,
Yeah.
increase self-harm, increase schizophrenia and psychosis, ED visits.
But
And that doesn't mention preventive health like cardiovascular disease. So
And trauma.
and the issue of people driving while impaired has been shown elsewhere that most of them will drive impaired, know it. And so it's a reckless area as well. And ultimately, there is recommendation for safety sensitive work that people should not be, and at all. No exceptions. From the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, or finalized this week.
So, Dr. Hegmann, appreciate it.
Maybe one more question. This is a great conversation. I don't want to put it off.
So it's a question, also a comment. So the graph that Ken was made a comment on, part of that could also be practice effects. And then what Melissa was talking about, how someone who drinks regularly and then has a pint and then drives or whatever, there's practice effects there. Like you're used, you know how to drive when you are impaired. And so that actually does, and I'm not encouraging that. I'm just saying that when I drink, I can drive that there's practice effects that are going on in this particular study. And there's also practice effect when it comes to how people interact with whatever substance they're partaking in, right? And so they can get better at doing things that they really shouldn't be doing because they've done it a few times. So in this case, it leads to, it could lead to, conclusions that are not quite what we want to in terms of the study, but also it can lead to more reckless behavior among those who are practiced at it because they feel like they're more competent and more capable because they've done it before.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I do think that it does contribute a little bit to the overall data that we have on this subject, especially since it's consistent with what we know. There are problems and these are difficult studies to do. And so we take it and we add it to our sort of repertoire of what we know about THC, and hopefully it helps with public safety and going forward. So thanks very much.
Last comment from Black that I'll echo. Great job methodically describing a nuanced study topic and keeping the audience oriented, the most important aspects along the way. Very well done.
Low to low risk. I think that from patient to person, like, get it in control.
That was an example. Well, we obviously had a non-controversial topic, and now we'll go to another non-controversial topic.
Cool.
So my name is Kurt Hegmann. I direct the center for those who don't know, but that doesn't matter. And what I'm going to demonstrate is what not to do with Journal Club, which is take a topic for which you're not an expert. But I'm doing this with a specific purpose and intent. Now, normally, of course, you wouldn't present on something where you're not an expert, especially on a review article, and that's what I chose. And so, why on earth would I do something like that? Well, at some point in time, if I'm forced to address something because it's actually making me address it for whatever reason, then, and especially if there's people hyperventilating about a subject, the first thing I gotta do is get data. And that's the primary message from this talk is get data, original quality data. And the prior presentation by Matt demonstrated an example with a decent quality randomized controlled trial, experimental design. What I'm going to do is review a little bit about the whole climate change thing, just from a high level, without actually taking any position on it. Now, I just happened to have been at the University of Padua on the left, and for our students in the audience, you see where the lady's standing right there? That's where the student sits, even today, to defend their thesis. So you're surrounded in the lion's pit. So anybody who wants that, we could actually construct that if you wanted, wouldn't it? Ken, wouldn't that be fun? I mean, and I'm going to note that there's a propensity for us to extrapolate, okay? And we see this all the time. People say, oh, there's this or that trend in data. And so I just note, for those who are not around here, in March 2023, we had record snow. You're looking, this is without snowshoes, you're looking down at a 12-foot high roof line, okay, in powder snow. That's how high, unbelievable amounts of snow. And of course, people extrapolate and like, oh, we're going to have another great winter this winter. It's like, well, maybe. And so this propensity to just extrapolate things is another problem we see all the time. So regarding this whole subject, it's really fascinating data, I think, from a non-climatologist's perspective. And this is because we actually have some real data to measure from the ice cores and the benthic or bottom of the ocean sediments. And there's different data sets that can be correlated. And these are really the numbers that are being used and talked about. The Greenland ice cores, the Antarctic ice cores, and they have a number of sites. You can see in the inset in the lower right there. There's a number of cores that have been produced all over Antarctica as an example. The Dome Sea, the drilling depth there is almost 11,000 feet deep. Isn't that fascinating? And the estimations are it's about 800,000 years before present, includes 8 glacial periods. And one of the things that, I don't know if people are being taught this stuff, but I certainly was never taught that glacials start in a period of like 30 years. 30 years? Did anybody get taught that? No, not a hand. Okay. Think about that, 30 years. And by the way, the last glacial they're estimating, the temperature difference globally was about 12 degrees, 11, 12 degrees difference, okay? But at the higher, the Canada areas, it's like 25 degree difference. So quite a bit more impact. We're going to get to that Canada versus Hawaii thing in a moment. So we've got a lot of data here that have been actually cranked. So this is a review article, which makes it really hard to review because you're immediately dealing with numerous other data, right? They're being compiled and you're trying to present, I'm trying to present representing like all these other studies, which I don't know anything about. But that's not, that's not the thrust of this. The observational data that they have are just that. They're observational data, right? Those data appear to be highly reproducible from all these data sets all over the place. You know, it's been again and again and again, all these cores. I mean, you want to go drill another ice core in Antarctica and find different results, go ahead. That's the, you know, that's the Einstein do the experiment twice and expect a different result, right? However, the overall quality of the analyses is a different issue. In other words, trying to figure out what came first. Does CO2 go up first and then does the temperature go up, or they just go up at the same time, or what causes that? Well, those are low quality data. There's no experimental design. You just had a prior Journal Club article, which was a experimental design. We actually controlled a bunch of things and then made one change. There's no such thing here going on. So that's why, you know, this is ultimately, if we look at a big picture from what we do in Journal Club of low quality, medium quality, high quality data analyses, is we go in the low quality area, despite tons of studies backing it up. If you look at, oh, by the way, on the left, that's the ice core that I blew up. You can see the black band is a volcanic ash deposition. This would be fun work, except going to Antarctica might not be so fun other than the first trip for a few days to experience it. Especially if you were there in the winter, their winter. So if you look before present, you can see it as a blown up graph here. We've got the temperature, we've got oxygen measures, we've got CO2 in the orangish, reddish, and then we've got methane. And I don't know about you all, but I don't think I would take a position on which came first of what is going on here. And of course, that's not what we're reading in press articles and so forth. So, and if we look at the cycles, you know, this is now going to 800,000 years on the left before present, up to the present. This almost looks like a switch goes on, you know, for the glacials and the getting in and out of the glacial periods. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Raising the question of, you know, what's driving what. The article, if you read the article, you would see numerous times it's one theory after another theory after another theory, and qualified language being used. It's very well written. I'm not knocking it. It's very well written. But the data from a standpoint of a consumer are interesting. And I don't know what to say other than they're not really, to me, they're not really explaining how things get switched on and off to that degree. That's one challenge. And then one interesting element of this that is probably somewhat explicable is on the right graph. There is some evidence that the changes are more abrupt and intense in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. That is logical if you think about it from the standpoint, where's all the land mass? From the northern hemisphere, not the southern. I'm going to actually skip ahead so we have enough time to talk about this. The strengths of this are there are so many data sets involving so many different types of data. Data samples of various measures. We don't have in this article any statistics, but this is the point where you don't even need statistics. I mean, your correlation coefficients are going to be like 0.9, you know, across the data, right? They're going to be really, really high. The limitations are association versus causal, what we talk about all the time in Journal Club. The other thing is the younger half of this room would not know that in 2016 we were not supposed to have any ice in the Arctic anymore. That was a serious forecast. Those who are older, remember that. Didn't come to pass. But that doesn't mean that the theory is flawed, right? Well, the theory needed adjustment. That doesn't mean that the substance of the theory is actually wrong. Let's put it that way. As I look at trying to summarize a discussion, the fastest rises in the CO2 obviously have occurred in the past 30 years. And if you go back from the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the current time, we have almost doubling of the CO2 levels, which according to the models should have raised our temperatures by like 7 degrees. Well, I can tell you we are nowhere near a rise of 7 degrees. No data set, even the ones where they're from airports like Salt Lake, which is now surrounded by concrete, so get a bias on the high side. So there's obviously other factors going on, and we need more explanation of it. You can get an ice age in about 4-degree temperature change. And I mentioned the fastest change into an ice age of about 30 years. It's obviously we got a lot of data, right? That they've gone all over the place, tons of papers. I don't have no idea how many there are, showing these correlations being amazingly strong. And yet we harken back to the problem of the strengths and the weaknesses of association versus causation. And to be very clear, I've not taken any, I'm purely trying to review this material so you, at least we all have some knowledge of what's driving the climate discussions that are going on all over the place that are causing us. And yes, I put solar on my house, okay? So, you know, I'm taking my emotions and throwing them out the window because I'm like, give me the data. You know, you're asking us to make a $2 trillion investment. Give me the data. So with that, let me do it. So we've in our journal club, we've told people we want you to put a little bit of AI into it. And AI was very interested in certain aspects of this. I did do, create PowerPoint slides about how quickly an ice age can start, and almost everything was irrelevant. I then said, okay, well, tell me what Yellowstone looked like in the ice age. And this is what it said the ice age looked like in Yellowstone. And I'm like, that is not the ice age in Yellowstone, you know? And then out comes this guy who won the Turing Award, if you remember the movie. But anyway, who's the guy who wrote this article, or no, I'm sorry, the article was written by the Wall Street Journal saying that AI is dumber than a pet cat. So there are good uses for it, but there's some problems with it. So then I happened to, fly in a great flight back to Salt Lake, and the Grand Teton is there on the left. I'm thinking, okay, that's not what it would really look like in the ice age, but I can tell you flying over Greenland, that's about what it would look like in Yellowstone, right? And AI didn't do too good a job on that. So then I started to have even more fun with it, because I thought to myself, what would it say about Hawaii in the Ice Age? And so this is Hawaii in the Ice Age. And so it's a 5-legged animal standing on a boat, and there's like a couple shacks on the shore, and there's icicles on coconut trees. And coconut trees are USDA Zone 10 trees. They absolutely do not tolerate even freezing, okay? Some palm trees do. Coconuts do not. So then I decided, well, looking at that animal, I want to, okay, just give me Ice Age animals. And so this is what it comes up for Ice Age animals. And I'm like, man, I think the 8-year-old crowd can do a better job than this. So basic, in a few minutes left, and this is just open discussion, what do you think this all means about, global warming, climate change, and stuff like that? But non-controversial topic, Open discussion, please.
A comment. I think, we're talking about how much money to put into this, right? And I just pulled up an article just today. There's a $250 billion proposal on the table that's to some people not nearly enough. And I said billion, 250 billion. That happened today. This is pledging that by 2035 in the COP29 summit. Anyway, on climate change. And I guess I've heard a lot, I'm interested in this topic, and I've kind of come to this idea that the models really don't tell us much over the course of the next several decades. They don't give us a lot of really great data. If they did, I think, wow, yeah, let's throw 250 billion at it, or $1 trillion, or 2 trillion, like you said. But the models kind of go haywire, in my opinion, over the next 40, 50 years. And so I've come to believe that our money really should be spent on the people that are going to have their feet on the ground in 50 years, the students and the young people, the greatest problem solvers that this world's ever seen. And I think that money could go to programs like that are educating people, and people are learning about the data. And I think that money would be better spent on students rather than on a problem that really we don't necessarily have a lot of answers for right now. That's kind of my thought. And, you know, I'm kind of a lefty, so that's a weird thought for me to go to after my research. Just a comment.
We accept any and all contributions to help us educate.
I say all that because, and I say all that knowing that you don't want us to jump to conclusions, and I appreciate that. And I do that. I see it in myself all the time, Dr. I appreciate you reminding me not to jump to conclusions.
Yeah, thank you. On that point, this is we wrote it in the Moser management text. The first thing to do with any controversy is check the facts, confirm the facts. It's always the rule one. It doesn't matter if it's a scientific controversy or if it's an HR controversy. Rule one is always check the facts. And if you're married, you understand this very well. If you don't understand that, you will not be married long. Other comments? Got off topic there, please.
Just kind of building off what you said. I know like there's a lot of like, I guess controversies, the word surrounding putting like money into like initiatives like that. But even if it's like unrelated to climate change, like isn't it like more of a good thing that we're kind of focusing more on like trying to conserve like our environment and like just kind of bettering ourselves? It's not that we have like technology to maybe not take up fossil fuels all the time, because they're going to run out eventually. It's probably good to start sticking like money into these initiatives where we have renewable energy, so we don't have to worry about it. That's kind of the way I see it. So instead of like ignoring the process, all this renewables that we know is going to be there.
Well, and I notice I didn't take a side on any of that, right? And I did mention we've got solar, but there is a high cost, however, for all the minerals and the ores, and there's a big question about whether the CO2 volume produced from renewables versus non-renewables really differs. I mean, all that said, developing sources of energy that do not rely on the Middle East seems like also a politically good idea. Please.
On a note closer to home, you were showing that slide that showed like 12 feet of snowfall. And we know that last year we had record snowfall in our mountains, 13 to 14 feet. Yet just last week, studies were coming and saying that the Great Salt Lake is decreasing again to dangerous levels of water. Is it because water districts are not releasing record amounts of water to replenish the Great Salt Lake, and therefore we're getting toxins in the air because the shoreline, I mean, the lake is receding and more shoreline is exposed to those toxins? What can we do about here at home? I mean,
well, another topic I'm not an expert on, but my understanding is primarily a number of people watering lawns and irrigation of the farmland are the two sources, and so that would drive the lower lake levels. And I mean, we had a huge surge after the 23 runoff, but in the lake. But of course, it's going to go down if we continue the way we're going with using the water. Which, by the way, if you're not old enough, in the 1980s, we were told we had to build the pumps into the West Desert because otherwise we're going to flood out Salt Lake City. That was the projection, again, projecting forward what was going on at the time in the middle 80s. It's amazing how we do that throughout all what we do. We just project prior recent trends into the future.
Well, if we're going to project future trends, I suspect nuclear power and nuclear energy being a good projection. And then that comes with increased opportunity to people in occupational health and safety, right? So job security is good if we continue to do that.
Well, 3 Mile Island is coming back on. I mean, the cost of the Google search versus the AI search is tenfold for the AI search over Google search. So they're going to put 3 Mile Island back online. And I'm old enough to remember when it had the partial meltdown. And I can tell you the idea of it coming back online is just absolutely shocking. I do have to hold on to this lectern when I make that comment. Please.
I think I'm too young, but
Good for you.
Mile Island and a lot of these like nuclear meltdown sites weren't a lot of those like didn't a lot of those happen because the sites weren't like properly updated and like upgraded as like the safety standards changed or like the training wasn't there, because I know that was the issue with Chernobyl, but like that was a whole other issue.
Yeah, well, Chernobyl's also a completely different structure of a reactor with a carbon core that we don't use. We've never used in the United States. That's a totally different animal. And in our case, my recall is there were errors, human factor related issues that drove the 3 Mile Island issue. Ken?
Chernobyl, they were running on non-recommended experiments. They were goofing, playing
Yeah,
with it,
right,
and got out
exactly.
of hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw.
3 Mile Island, the control system wasn't really great. When the operators flipped the switch to open a valve, it said that the valve was open. But rather than the valve being open, it showed that the signal was sent for the valve to open. So the valve was still closed. So it was poor program.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. I love that.
Thank you.
Great detail.
Can I have one more question? I know we're out of time. Talk about the idea of contentious topics. I mean, the previous article. Put in some restrictions in place on that. How do you approach the job of trying to not only sort of guide yourself by the data, but encourage others to focus more on the data than the argument going on around it, just to, I guess, make an impact on the issue when it's contentious?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to make an impact on this one, but generally speaking, if there is a contentious situation, I think that, again, if we start with confirm the facts and we get to agree on facts, we usually narrow the goalposts. So I've been in, I don't know how many, interesting scenarios, especially through the science and the guidelines that I headed for almost 5 years. And if you can corral and agree to a core set of facts, you'll end up with many fewer, you'll end up with better solutions to which you can agree, or at least you'll have close opinions. And that pretty much, I think, is what happened with our marijuana guideline, to take that example, is when we found the data are just so overwhelming that it's just, you're not going to be able to clear people to use it, safety sensitive work. You're not going to want to have them ripping around in the forklift and the plant. It's just like, forget it. And even the people who were more, I think, liberal looked at the data and said, what are you going to do? And so there ended up being shockingly zero argument, zero discussion. And by having worded those arguments, when we went to extensive external peer review, we got exactly zero comments negative about it. So,
That's just the science, and the politics of it is a different story.
oh, we don't do that. We don't do that.
Okay.
So, all right.
All right, well, lastly, I just want to thank Dr. Hegmann and Matt by doing the CDC. It has the deadline going well in advance and basically a bunch of additional stuff in addition to just the normal journal club prep. So thank you, both of you, for doing that. This was our last journal club of the semester. I guess Thanksgiving and then finals week and all that. And so you guys have a break for a couple months. We'll be back in early January.